Well, as we've been hearing, a lot of anger there in the south of France, and protests ahead of the G20 summit have taken place almost as often as the meeting itself, but with little success. So could it be different this year when we bear in mind that the growing global discontent with the way governments deal with the crisis? Do you think people will actually be listened to this time?
I think there's a chance that the pressure on the G20 will start to prove, if not quite overwhelming, but very, very substantial, and that's pressure from all quarters. All of the leaders meeting today know that they go back to their countries when the summit is over and see populations increasingly discontented with the way they've been running the world and the way the crisis has been handled up until now. I think what you're seeing in Nice is a reflection of that. And of course all the security precautions, indicate just how little legitimacy this group really has. It shouldn't be the case that the world's leaders have to meet behind great big steel fences with the police out and all the rest of it if they enjoyed the legitimacy of the people they claim to represent. So yes, there is a huge amount of pressure on them, and there is also, I think, the potential for change. One
of those leaders attending is, of course, the Greek Prime Minister. Now, given that today he's sent world markets crashing thanks to the fact that he's putting the latest rescue deal to a referendum, asking the Greek people on whether they will accept the conditions of the latest aid package. Now, he's not going to be that welcome there, is he?
He's not going to be welcome amongst the G20, maybe not, but I think this is an entirely reasonable thing for him to be doing. Perish the thought that the people who are the victims of the various so-called rescue packages that the EU and the IMF and the ECB have cooked up for the last 18 months or so. Perish the thought that they should actually be allowed to decide whether they want these things. It's quite striking that markets have reacted so badly to a sort of elementary democratic claim about the world. I find that really, it's indicative of the way that financial markets think. Of course, the Greek Prime Minister isn't going to be popular amongst the rest of the G20, but I don't see any reason why that should prevent a referendum taking place.
Well, as you say, a great display of democracy there, but of course the Greeks, they're fearing that the retirement age is going to have to go up, the VAT hike, cut in public sector wages. These austerity measures are really going to hurt them, so it's pretty likely they are going to turn it down, aren't they, and say no. If they do, what are the implications?
Well, if we get as far as a referendum, there are a number of steps that he has to get through first, that this government has to get through first, not least of which is a confidence vote on Friday. The opposition, or at least the principal opposition party there, is demanding new elections rather than a referendum. So it's no guarantee that the referendum will take place. If they do get a no vote, which does at this point in time seem, frankly, pretty likely, then the potential for all hell breaking loose is quite immense. Greece would be in the position of most likely having to default on its debt, and also most likely having to exit the euro. In some disarray for the other euro countries, but perhaps this gives the opportunity for Greece to rebuild its economy, which has been shattered by continued euro membership and continued austerity programmes, and perhaps gives the opportunity for the Greek people to sort themselves out and begin to, take some control back over their own economy and society.
You mean to say Greece could exit the euro? Wouldn't this set off a domino effect and completely undermine the whole idea of the eurozone? This would be a disaster, wouldn't it, for the eurozone, or not?
It depends on whose point of view you take in these things. I think what we've seen over the last probably 2 years now, as the crisis has unfolded, is an awful lot of the very deep underlying structural problems in the euro. The fact there's a bunch of pretty dissimilar economies lashed together with a single currency, a single monetary system. That has started to expose, the crisis has started to expose some of those structural problems. And what we're seeing at the moment is, I think, something approaching the end game for those structural problems. At the very least, we might well anticipate quite a fundamental reordering of how the euro operates out of all this. Now, there is an argument out there that this should mean greater fiscal union, this should mean greater monitoring of how European governments choose to spend their money and choose to raise taxes. That's one possible outcome of it. Given the disorder that's actually taking place, and given what's just taking place or potentially taking place in Greece with the referendum, perhaps the more likely thing is a steady disintegration of the euro. All of these are of course, possibilities at the moment.
Well, talking about that,
much could change in the next few weeks.
Yes, talking about that referendum in Greece, it's interesting that, of course, many believe that the bankers and the politicians are to blame for the Greek financial troubles. But maybe this is a clever way of giving the people a say, and in that respect, it's an attempt to pass the blame on to the people's will on what the outcome is going to be.
Well, that could have been one of the calculations Papandreou has made about hosting the referendum, which otherwise came as something of a bolt from the blue, rather. So possibly it's by forcing the issue back onto the people he's pretty much claimed to represent, but very, very obviously failed to do so for the last year or so. Perhaps that's one route out of the crisis for him, an attempt to restore something like legitimacy to an otherwise deeply, deeply unpopular government. Not that it changes really people's anger, or actually well-directed anger against the financial system, against the financiers and against the politicians who got them into this mess.
Talking about the mess, so much disunity and disorganisation, and of course some arguments and tension behind the scenes. Interesting to see that Jean-Claude Trichet has passed the baton of the European Central Bank now to Italy's Mario Draghi. Clearly a very dramatic point in the Euro's history. Can we expect anything to come out of that? Any change in policies, do you think? Will it make any difference?
That seems very unlikely. The ECB will pretty much carry on as it always has done, as kind of the bondholders' last friend in Europe, attempting wherever it can to wash its hands of the crisis, really not acting as a lender of last resort, not that it has particularly a capability of doing that, and essentially sitting there and demanding further austerity measures from countries affected by the sovereign debt crisis, which includes Greece and Portugal and Spain and Italy. I doubt that the change of leadership at the top will make any fundamental difference to the kind of policies that they want to push through.
James, this referendum in Greece, many saying it's going to threaten to scupper the euro bailout. They're saying this could be a disaster for the eurozone. But are we now actually looking at a real critical moment for the status of the eurozone and the future? I mean, where are we now? Because the amount of media interpretation over the past few months, indeed over the last year, we always seem to be reaching a critical stage. Where exactly are we now, particularly bearing in mind with what's happening with Greece?
I think, well, we always are reaching a critical stage, and then a final reckoning has been deferred and deferred and deferred for really the last more than a year, essentially since the first bailout of Greece back in March 2010. The collective leadership of the EU, between the EU, the ECB and now the IMF, have managed to kind of push off any kind of decisive change to the situation, any kind of decisive moves against the structures of the Eurozone which would resolve the crisis that's now happening. What we're really talking about here is that, look, the Greek debt is unpayable. There is no real chance of Greece ever repaying the colossal mountain of sovereign debt that has built up there in the course of the crisis. It has to default at some point. What we're looking at the moment is really a kind of a process by which that default might be enacted. It may take place under the guise of the IMF and the EU deal that was struck last week, or it may take place at the behest essentially of the Greek people, something like Argentina in late 2001, where they simply decide that they're not going to pay the debt, they can't pay the debt, and therefore they won't pay the debt. Now, the potential for lots and lots of other events, for wider banking crises and the rest of it, arising from either of these two situations is very substantial. So I think we're reaching the end of one kind of phase of the crisis inside the Eurozone, and perhaps the opening of another one.
James, always interesting to talk to you. Thanks so much for your thoughts on this. James Meadway, Senior Economist at the New Economics Foundation, joining us there in London. Thanks.